Raising educational standards is the priority of many governments of the world. And to achieve this objective, we often hear about educational reforms. In today's program, we will talk more about educational reforms, and we are pleased to welcome in our studio Professor Vinayagum Chinapah, UNESCO Regional Advisor for Educational Planning in the Arab States. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, could you tell us more about educational reforms itself?
Educational reforms are more comprehensive, systematic, and well organized for a longer period. A reform takes time, whereas you can have education change, educational innovations, which are just, some small pieces of the reform. So the term educational reform comprehends and should be comprehended in such a way that it is not only education that we are talking about. When we talk about educational reform, we talk about the reform of the society at large. So education is the element that is either reflecting the changes, addressing the changes, or creating the changes in the society. So an educational reform is comprehensive in such a way that it tackles the problems of the society at large from a political, cultural, economic point of view. So it can accompany the reform of the society, or it can create the reform in the society. So it's like a chicken-egg controversy that we never know which one comes first.
Okay. So could you elaborate on the reasons so as to why there is a need to reform the educational system?
Normally, educational systems tend to be very conservative. Any changes, any reforms, any innovations are not easy to get on board. So when you find that the output from the system, that is the graduates from the systems, are not, the education they have received, the skills that have been developed, their competencies, their attitudes are not matching with the demand of the society either immediately or in the medium term or in the long term. So then your system is counterproductive. Okay. So you go on and see, how can we meet these new challenges? And take the case of Mauritius. Can you today assume to have anybody in the society to be illiterate? Nobody can function. Even, talking about illiteracy, not only reading and writing, even, through the SMS, through the small, the use of modern technology. So we need to be even computer literate. So how can you become computer literate when you have not gone through the different reform stages? That's why we talk about educational reforms, which actually meet the demands that is coming from the outside of the system, of the educational system, which is much more the system as a whole, but not only the education one.
All right. Now, can you give us some examples of recent reforms in other countries and how they have been implemented?
I will give you, there are many reforms taking place from different angles. As I am advisor to the member states, to the countries of the Arab regions, the one which is being referred to very much is the Egyptian reform. Okay. In Egypt, which is quite a big country in that region, I was the one who helped the government to develop the reform. And as in many countries, Egypt wanted also to go for quality, okay, as we always want to have. When you look at a system of education, like the case of Egypt, the case of Jordan, the case of Oman, these are the countries I've been working very closely with, and some of the European countries also. First step that these countries look at how to promote an education of quality. Okay. Because they have been able to have all their children in schools. Now they say, what are they learning? Right? So the reform then addressed immediately the question of the curriculum. Is the curriculum relevant? That's number one. Is teaching effective? That is number two. Yeah. Is learning taking place the way it should? That is number three. Are we doing more with less? That is number four. So these are criteria being used in these countries like Egypt. In Jordan, they said, look, we don't have petrol, we don't have gold, we don't have anything. That is natural resources, which is the case of this country, Mauritius, right?
Yeah, of course.
So the reform is addressed the human capital, people. Let invest more and more into people, and it's through people, for the investment, that we will get return. So again, where do you invest for the people? Is for the school.
Yeah, of course.
So that the education reform becomes something that is necessary for promoting any reform the society wants. They want to become a high-tech society, they want to become a knowledge-based society. All these have to go through the educational reform. Jordan is one, Egypt is another one, and you have some countries that have a lot of money, that the Gulf countries, like Oman, which I have advised also, they don't know what to do with the money. You see, they say, well, we can live 100 years without working, for example. But it is our nation. They want to Omanize this. We don't want our country to be run only by expatriates, which is the case. Mm-hmm. We don't want the women in these societies, they want to be useful. They have money, and they want to go and teach. So they want to reform the system so that they will have the majority of the teachers, basically women, would be the Omani. So you see how from various perspectives, the reform is just reflecting the needs of the society at a given point in time, but also from a long-term perspective, how do you invest today to reap the fruits of the 20, 30 years? And we have gone through that in most countries of the world.
Yeah. Well, now, Professor, how can the educational system benefit from reforms?
The educational system very often is being understood as primary, pre-primary, secondary, technical, vocational, and tertiary. Mm-hmm. That is system. This is the structure, right? Okay. But this education is not only structure. It needs to have teaching, it needs to have learning, it needs to have textbooks, it needs to have the curriculum, all these elements mentioned earlier. So in order to have an impact on the educational system, there should be some research and development taking place. We need to know whether what is in the textbooks are really being a reflection of what the society would require from the standpoint of the teacher and the learner. So the content analysis to make education relevant. That is one element you bring to the system. The other system is pedagogy, teaching and learning process, or teaching methods. Are we teaching the same way as we have been teaching for decades? Has there been some innovation in teaching? Because when you go to teach at training college or to any teaching formation for faculties of education, you say, oh, education should be learner-centered. What does that mean, learner-centered? Do we really, as teachers, have we been taught how to become learner-centered? The pedagogy should be directed toward the learner. In our teaching, day-to-day teaching learning process, do we really care for everybody in the classroom? So there's innovation in pedagogy. Yeah. Is it purely theoretical? Is it purely in text but not taking place? I can guarantee that 9 out of 10 teachers in the world are teaching the same way that people have been teaching for decades. I say 9 out of 10. Only innovation in pedagogy or in experimental schools, small project schools here, because as I told you, you cannot create reform through the teaching learning process without a revision of the structure of incentives of the teaching profession. Incentives does not mean only financial. It means knowledge. Knowledge is an incentive. You have to expose to see how the interaction in the classroom can provide additional dividends to the learner. If the learner does not get anything about your interactive pedagogy, there is no need to talk about it. Okay? Yeah. So you look from the standpoint of pedagogy, from the standpoint of content. You can use many ways of how this reform from these angles comes in the system, and it changes the system. You see, from monologue, rote learning, towards child-centered education and interactive pedagogy. As an example, I mean, there are many other areas, but just to cite some of them.
Well, and what about the factors that influence educational reforms?
The main factor would be, is in most cases a political one, right? In many cases, because there is a pressure that access has not been given, there have not been total access to education. Quality has not been completed to a certain acceptable standard. Governance is not being met the way it should be said. So a promise from one point in time not met become, symbolic and become a sort of a platform for these reforms to take place. Promise that have not been met. That one. The other side is the economy changed very fast. The world changed very fast. So you have outside pressure on the demands regarding skills, competencies, attitudes and behaviors, as I mentioned earlier. So these are pressures that are coming that you cannot avoid. And that tell you, oh, let's go and do our homework now. Are we really providing the type, the quality of education that we are supposed to in view of these emerging needs and challenges?
Yeah. And according to you, what are the points to be considered before reforming an educational system actually?
First, the reform is not something that takes place at one point in time. The results will take time also. So the first thing is the time element, the planning or the programming of a reform. It should be programmed. When programming says that you will achieve this and this over a given period of time. That's number one, the time factor. The second is the resources. You don't say you will give high quality education to everybody when there are no resources. So you plan for the resources as well. Third, for what? What do you want to achieve? You should know what you want to achieve. It means that you need to have that strategy in front of you, saying that by the year 2050, we would like to achieve this, this, and this, and this.
Set an objective, in short.
It should be there, and you monitor it, because at the time you decide to launch the reform, you set the benchmark, and then you go through over a period of time, go back and forth, correct the misgivings, look for the additional resources, provide the necessary elements, components that would accompany the reform.
Okay, you just mentioned about benchmark. Could you elaborate a little bit about benchmark?
Benchmarking is an indicator system that first make a sort of, like when you go to see a doctor, to make it very simple to people, the doctor first make all type of tests on you to know how you are today. On the basis of these results, that is the benchmarks, it provides you all types of necessary, medical treatments and so on. The same thing for the system. When you make the benchmark, you will know how sick is the system.
Where you stand, actually.
Where do you stand? You promise, you need to have certain standards to look at. And from there you say, with the available resources and time, I will be able to monitor the progress. Benchmark are used to monitor progress.
Okay. Now, according to you, what are the problems associated with educational reforms?
The political will, number one. Number two, as I mentioned, resources. Number three is to empower people to participate in the reform. A reform cannot be dictated from the top to the bottom. It should come from the bottom up. And it should be participatory. All major stakeholders should participate. Not only education one, also the non-education people, like the private sector, local communities, NGOs, all these. They are major actors for.
And what about the problems associated? That is, how they can create problem.
The
if
reform
necessary
may be
steps are not taken,
If it is non-participatory, then it is value loaded. A given group want reform for others.
Yeah.
You see, that is the basic problem. So if a reform is not participatory, because the reform is not meant to satisfy the needs of a given group, whether they are decision makers, whether they are private employee or whatever. It should be participatory so that you are sure it will succeed.
Okay. Now, one of the barriers of educational reforms are believed to be resistances. It can be on the part of parents, teachers, or even students. Now, in your opinion, what could be the reason for resistance to reforms?
People don't like to change. Everybody wants to do the same thing, and they have, the habits are there. So change, reforms, these are, risky. Yeah. Nobody wants to take risk, new risk. And you are happy, with the old ways. Why something new? But the mindset, if you don't tell, you don't show convince the value added for the reform. So parents, for example, may say, what again the reform? Why do we need reform? But they should be informed about what is it about. Why there is a need for a reform, and also what is the benefit, the value added. If those who are conducting the reform does not know themselves, what would be the value added of the reform? How can you expect parents, how can you expect the learner to know about a reform? It's like a campaign. You need to bring people on board, and to bring people on board, you need to empower them. You need to empower people to change. Empowerment means share. Allow people to talk. Mauritius is a case where it's a democratic society where you can at least express yourself. But in many societies, you can't. Here you have golden opportunity, whatever reform, but if you don't use the opportunity, you may have. You can be democratic, but if you don't use all the facets of this democratic principle and practice, encourage all the stakeholders to participate. Have seminars. Let the parents come and say what they think about the reform. Let the students organize themselves. This is what is done in many of the affluent countries. Reform is a process. It's a multi-stakeholder process. It is participatory, and it does not belong to one group of society. It's the society itself.
Now, what are the impacts of resistances on educational system?
Then it depends as well on the nature of the impacts, right? You can have different impacts. The first impact is that it delays the reform. If there are resistance, it delayed. And when it delays, it means that it can lead to counter reform, which implies that what you were doing wrong earlier, you are doing worse now. Okay? That is one element. The second element is that it increased the cost of the reform resistance. It means it become more costly. So the costly in terms not only of money, but the efforts, commitment towards the reform. Resistance also can make the reform half-done reform. It means that you reform the curriculum.
Achieve your objective, actually.
You reform your curriculum, but the teachers will not implement the reform. So what's the use of having a curriculum reform without having it being implemented, right? Another example is resistance. And from the standpoint of the learner, you cannot just add subjects workload to for the learner, because they don't have a voice to say, stop it, it's enough now. They don't have that. So again, your objective to use the reform to have a higher dividend, higher value, efficiency, and all these is half the way, because the major actors and beneficiaries are not participating in it.
Yeah.
And that's why many reforms have failed.
So all the stakeholders should be convinced, actually.
Of course.
This is what you mean.
Of course, and it should be coming from them as well. See?
Now, problems might also arise if wrong decisions are taken. Okay. Now, in this case, would it be right to say that resistance is justified?
A difficult question, I would say. Wrong decisions are always results of lack of consultation, lack of transparency, lack of participation, right? Because the decision is not just comes like that. There's a process behind. And resistance, as we have been talking already, is only one single element. But if you think about wrong decisions, there's no trust and confidence. Confidence building and trust are very important element for success in any reform, whether it is an educational one, health sector reform, political reform. If there's no trust and there's no confidence that you have created with your constituency, like our constituencies are the learners, the teachers, the parents, the society as large. So the constituency should be with you. And you should be trusted by your constituency, and you should trust your constituency. Otherwise, there's no reform.
Okay. Now, once reforms have been carried out, is there any evaluation that takes place, and how?
The evaluation takes place in the process of the reform itself, because the benchmark we talked earlier. Yeah. You cannot have benchmark without making an evaluation. Where do you stand? But the sad story is evaluation is often used to justify the reform, to criticize the reform, to find only the bad news about the reform, whereas evaluation should be accompanying the reform. That's why we use the term monitoring instead.
Okay.
Monitoring and evaluation. Because you cannot expect after 20 years to say that things have gone wrong. You should have detected that already over the period of time.
And what sort of monitoring is being carried out currently?
Generally, the monitoring takes place on a regular basis. They should have periodic reports, so peer review, external evaluation over a period of time. Okay. These reports are systematically analyzed and feedback. When you say monitor, it means that you don't find whether the weaknesses or strengths, but by finding the weaknesses immediately, you suggest certain remedial action. That is monitoring. Evaluation, no. Good or bad.
Yeah. So monitoring is better.
Of course.
Well, in our country, the educational system is under reform. What would be your advice to teachers, parents, or even students to adapt themselves to changes?
First, I am going to repeat myself again. The reform of our educational system is not the reform of the minister of the ministry or the government. It's a Mauritian reform. So we are all Mauritians, whether we are students, whether we are teachers, whether we are parents. So the first thing is the reform is our reform. The second one is how can we participate effectively to make it successful. The third one, we should be trusted that we also know something. Okay. So we should be listened by those who may not giving the voice to everybody. So we should take our voice back and say, we want the reform, it's our reform, let's do it, and let's do it together.
A final message from you, Professor.
Good luck.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. It's been an honor to have you here. Well, viewers, thank you for your attention. Until we meet next time, it's goodbye from us.